Hello, and welcome to the second in this series of talks on beginning Zen training. The last time we looked at what is basically the essence of the Zen training, what we call the daily life practice, which is to give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. And this giving of myself, which has a technical term, samadhi, Sanskrit term meaning being at one with. Out of this samadhi arises the awareness, what's sometimes called mindfulness. This is often described as being the beginning, the middle, and the end of the practice. But it can be spoken of in many ways, and as we begin to unpack this principle, we see that it touches on many other aspects, and it's one of these other aspects that I'd like to have a look at in this talk, because in this talk I'm going to talk about the form, what's known as the form of things. And it's really just to notice and to realize that in fact things do have form. If you've ever been to a Zen temple or a Zen monastery, or even just to a Zendo, meditation hall, you'll notice that there are very precise ways of doing things. And it's not just in the Zen training, actually not even in Buddhism, in all religious institutions. If you go to a monastery or temple or somewhere, you'll see that there's a very clear and precise way of going about things. There'll be quite a strict timetable. People get up at a certain time, go to bed at a certain time. There'll be time for meditation or prayer, or for devotional services. There'll be time for eating and for work. There'll be work periods as well. And as well as this sort of daily timetable, there'll be a weekly timetable. So there may be a sort of break, a day off, a day of rest or something like that. And throughout the year, this year will be punctuated by sort of festival periods or holiday periods or retreat periods of more intensive spiritual practice. So there's this sort of ebb and flow, and this produces a structure, and it's this structure that's being referred to as the form. And this form isn't just something that's used in religious institutions, and we may be quite surprised to discover that this form actually is very natural to all living things, so though we may not feel it when we first go to, say, a Zen temple. Our first impression may be that we feel quite self-conscious about these rules that we have to follow. Then we feel a little bit afraid of them. But actually, all living things do have this capacity for form and use forms. The interesting thing is that apart from human beings, our animal brothers and sisters seem to have a series of unwritten rules. The forms aren't laid down or prescribed as such. They just seem to be lived out of. What is meant by this term, sort of, that living things have a form? Well, if we look at a dog, we can see that it has a way of behaving, a clear way of, dog behaviour. The same with cats as well. I know a little bit more about cats, being a cat owner myself. If you go into a room, you'll find the cat usually in the warmest spot, underneath a radiator or on the windowsill on a sunny day, basking in the sun perhaps. It has its own way of going about things that's distinctly cat-like, and this is the way of a cat. This is the form, or the forms that by which a cat lives. And if you happen to come back from doing your shopping, and you put your shopping in the kitchen on the floor, and the telephone suddenly goes, and you go and answer it, and it's a old friend you haven't spoken to for a long time, and you get into conversation for quite a while, and you come back 40 minutes later and one of the shopping bags is tipped over on its side. The contents pulled out, and the plastic bag with the wet fish in it has been ripped open. Contents have vanished, and sitting by the empty bag is your cat, licking his lips. Well, who's to blame? This is what cats do. Cats have an affinity for fish. If you leave a cat unguarded in a room where there's fish, you cannot be too surprised if that fish has actually gone on our return. And actually, as we look about it, all things seem to have certain affinities, certain ways of behaving. I mean, quite literally, the trees, when to put the leaves out and when to fruit and so on and so forth. So these forms are actually very important, and it's curious also just to note that it only appears to be human beings who have to codify forms and rules rather than living out of them inherently. And I'm reminded of a saying that comes from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, which is the Mahayana version rather than the Pali Canon version. And in this sutra, the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, it says that on his awakening underneath a Bodhi tree, the first words he spoke were, "How wonderful, how miraculous. All beings, but all beings, are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and the power of the Tathagata." The Tathagata being another appellation of the Buddha. And he went on to say, but sadly, because of their sticky attachments, human beings are not aware of it. So it seems to be, joining these two things together, Buddhistically speaking, that that our animal brothers and sisters simply live out of this Buddha nature quite unconsciously. Therefore they live out of their nature. They have therefore no need to sort of have extant or exoteric rules or legal professions and all the rest of it. But human beings, we don't feel constrained by our nature. We can behave impulsively. We can behave in a different way, because this is the curious things. If we look at the animal kingdom, animals, their instincts, which are not the same as our impulses. Actually, they're related, but they're not the same. Instincts always seem to be tied to a situation. So, for example, in the mating season, the animal mates. If there's hunger and you're looking after young, then off you go foraging. If you have to defend territory, then there's the time for aggression. But it's interesting, because even in cases like aggression, for example, nature actually uses aggression very sparingly. It doesn't just use it willy-nilly. I mean, if you've ever seen those natural history programs where, say, two male lions square up to each other over some territory, and it starts off, they bare their teeth at each other, and they growl, and they show their claws, and they puff up their manes, so to speak, and it becomes pretty obvious if there's a great difference in size and strength between the two of them. And in fact, it may not ever get onto an actual fight, which is just as well, because if you're armed with very powerful weapons like sharp teeth and claws, and you go around using them, indiscriminately, then very soon, and if the whole species is like that, well, very quickly the species is going to end up wiping itself out. So, actually, when you look at this behaviour, it almost seems choreographed. And of course, it's the instinct that does the choreography, and this is arising out of the nature of the creature. And it always tends to, not necessarily always, but generally it tends to be tied into the circumstance, tied into the situation. And if that situation doesn't arise, then the instinct doesn't arise either. And this seems to... This is what we're referring to when we're talking about the form of things, and it's something that's very important when we're looking at an Eastern religion like Buddhism, because unlike in the West, where nature is generally seen as fallen in some way, or quite often, in the East, nature is seen as perfect in its own right, and having its own inherent harmony. And we have to remember that, of course, Zen arose in China. Originally, one of the called Chan. Buddhism obviously came to China in round about the first century AD, somewhere around that period. Took a few hundred years to really put its roots down, but then it developed its own distinctive Chinese schools, one of which was the Chan school, otherwise known as Zen. And these schools very much have a Chinese flavour. And of course, one of the other native religions of China is Taoism. And of course, Taoism also has this sense of an inherent harmony in nature, and that really our task is to get back into harmony with nature. This is generally the thrust of Eastern religions in generally, but certainly in those Chinese religions as well, of which Zen is very much so. So it's this sense that actually we've fallen out of harmony with nature somehow, and we need to get back into it. And this thing about instincts and impulses is a very good example of this. Instincts are tied into circumstances, but our impulses, actually, these are something else. Impulses arise because they're connected with what I like and what I don't like, what suits me, what doesn't suit me, what I want, what I don't want, which can operate regardless of these circumstances, which is sometimes why we get ourselves into trouble. And of course, if we now go back to that saying of the Buddha, sadly, because of their sticky attachments, human beings are not aware of it. We remember that the primary sticky attachment in Buddhism, the primary attachment that the Buddha refers to, is the attachment to myself. And this attachment to myself, what suits me, what doesn't suit me, and so on, this is held up really as being the cause of our suffering, and ties us therefore right back to those early teachings of the Buddha, in particular those first teachings of the Buddha, given the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, where the Buddha said that because of sticky attachment, predominantly with I, this is where we go wrong. This is the cause of our suffering. And so to be gradually weaned away from this attachment is to become released from suffering in the Buddhist formula. So forms help us to actually live. This is the function that they have in life. This is the function they have in the natural world. They help animals live in their environment with each other, and to go about and conduct themselves, and to actually live the life. So a dog, in all circumstances, good, bad, and indifferent, behaves as a dog, and a cat as a cat, and so on and so forth. So, and it's not just animals, of course, that live in this way. Plants do. All living things do. And of course, strangely, or even perhaps even a little bit mysteriously, those instincts which, of course, have been honed over countless millennia, really seem to, or really give us the best opportunity for living in our environment and living, hopefully, a fulfilled life as well. I had a lovely story a good few years ago now of down in the Antarctic. There are a number of scientific survey stations where people go to carry out research. And anyway, there was a particular group who was studying the emperor penguins. And they're just there during the summer, because in the winter it's dark all the time. So in the winter they returned to the mainland, and they were on their way back when they suddenly realised they'd left the cat back at the station, at the scientific station. Well, there was no way they could go back now, and so they thought, well, that's it. And so when they returned in spring, they were half expecting to find the frozen body, but there was nothing there. But they thought, well, cat's obviously got out and probably frozen somewhere in the wilderness, couldn't not possibly have survived in that particularly hostile environment. And so they went back out onto the ice floes and began studying these enormous flocks of penguins who live together, and they breed together, and they raise their young together, and so on. And as they were looking at them through their binoculars, suddenly one of them said, "Hey, look, there's a little ginger penguin there. What on earth is that?" And as they looked a little more closely, suddenly they realized there was the cat. Cats find the warmest place. That is their instinct. And this cat somehow, miraculously maybe, had managed to find the one place in that incredibly hostile environment where it might just be possible to survive. And no doubt one or two eggs went missing, and maybe the odd chick, but the penguins, of course, didn't recognize the cat as a predator because he's not part of that environment, so they just accepted him and ignored him, of course. And he lost a few toes, of course, and a bit of the end of his tail to frostbite, but otherwise he survived. It's a rather heartwarming story, but it shows something about those instincts and those forms. And just how powerful and how necessary they are. Joseph Campbell, the American mythologist, used to call them life guides, which is perhaps gives another insight onto them. Well, it's not just animals who have forms. We human beings also do have forms too, and we use them every day. We have forms that we use quite unconsciously when we're with friends, for example, or when we're at work, or when we're with family, or when we meet a stranger. There are certain ways of behaving that we quite naturally conform to, that we simply adapt to and show. And these forms help us with our interactions with other people and with our environments as well. And certainly if we're in our work, if we have a job, and particularly if we're working with other people, then those forms become incredibly important because, for example, if you're a receptionist on a front desk somewhere, you may come in feeling absolutely lousy. The last thing you want to do is to talk to people, but your job says you must, and so you go we go through the motions. And if we're experienced at it and we're trained well enough, then we can bring it off, even though internally we may not feel like it. And actually this is really important because this shows the difference now between those impulses, which is how I am now, what I'm feeling now, what I want to do right now, and actually what the circumstances, what the situation demands of me. Can we actually overcome my personal gripes, my personal difficulties, whatever they are? Can I actually give myself into the situation truly and go along with it smoothly or not? This is the harmony. This is a good example of that Tao, of that Dharma, of that harmony that's to be found in things. Or will I stick out like the proverbial sore thumb? I remember my own teacher once saying that she never actually did have to have her appendix out, but she always said that if she did ever need to have her appendix out, she hoped very much that she would have a good old-fashioned surgeon who would take her appendix out in the traditional way, because if she was lying on the slab before him with her insides out, if he should at that moment become possessed of the most incredible idea, innovative, whatever, and feel a powerful urge to rush off and do something about it, that he would at least be able to contain himself until all her insides were put back in the right place, she was sewn up and on her way back to the ward, and that he could wash his hands, taken off his gown. Then what he does with that idea is entirely his own business. But until that moment, please, to hold oneself together. And this ability to be able to hold to a form, in that case the form of a surgeon performing a task, that ability to be able to see it through is a great virtue. And it's something that if we see it in other people, we find it very attractive, because it makes those people very dependable. They're the people who we know can keep their heads when all around them are losing theirs. That sort. That is a very powerful virtue, and is something that quite rightly has been admired. And this virtue is something that can be trained. We might think that it's people are born with it, but maybe some have a greater tendency to it than others. But actually, all of us can be trained in this, and this is precisely what a spiritual training gives us, and this is what's being referred to as the form. Now, this ability to be able to conform to circumstances, to let go of my way of doing things and to go along with things as they are, is always seen actually as a very good measure when people go into a monastic environment. When a novice monk or nun goes up to the main training place, they will be judged on their ability to fit in. And they will actually be told very little. Very little instruction is given. They are expected to use their eyes and their ears, and to just see how things are done, and then to fit in with it. Notice things and then simply fit in with it. Can they do that? And the speed at which they can do that, and their ability to do that, is seen as a good measure to their spiritual capabilities. What happens if I can't is that I've become rigid. I have my own way of doing things, in other words, my own forms. These are the ones that I prefer, the ones that suit me, and I don't want to give them up. Going into a new circumstance, I don't want to give them up, and I've known not many, but one or two situations, for example, where people have wanted to come into a zendo, and they didn't want to bow to the Buddha, but the form, the Buddha statue. It's explained to them that the Buddha statue, it's just paying respect to the Buddha, it's not bowing to a deity or anything. It's just, after all, you're coming to hear the Buddha's teachings, and so we pay respect to the one who is the founder. But some people just don't like bowing. And then they become rather shocked when they discover that they're not going to be allowed in. But this is the way it is, and I know, as I said, literally not many, but one or two situations where those things have actually occurred, and people have been turned away because, and it may seem rather shocking perhaps, but actually, unless people are able just a little bit to give up my own preferred ways, then frankly, how can we learn something new? If I come somewhere to learn something, but actually I'm too full of myself and my own views, then how am I going to take anything more in? We have to empty out if we're going to take anything new in. So this becoming flexible, letting go of this attachment to myself and how I want things to be, is pivotal in this training. And it's also why, as well, there's an old saying that says that the good Zen student should leave no traces, should leave no ripples, wherever he or she goes. And this is pointing to a very common behavior. I remember it well when I was living in a temple. People would come in, and we had a library there, as a lot of temples do. And people would come in, and they'd, a bit like at home, you take a book down off the shelf and you put it down, you read it, and then it's time to go. So you put it down on the table or on the floor, and you get up and walk away. Well, that sort of thing is really jumped on from a great height in a temple, because it's not just that it's leaving the place a bit messy, which of course it is, but there's a certain sort of callousness about it. There's a sense that, well, I've finished with this book, so it doesn't really matter what happens to it now, and off I go. I mean, I'm not saying it's people consciously think that, they don't. It's just negligent, but it's just it has a slight coldness about it, a disconnectedness with the needs of the situation. After all, the book belongs on the shelf, so when you finish, put it back on the shelf. Sometimes going into a person's house, you can go into the front room and you can see where where they were sitting yesterday, because there's a cup down by the side of the chair, and there's the remote controls on the arm of the chair, and there's a newspaper or a magazine or something by the chair as well, and it's almost like there's this sort of nest building going on, and it's all with me at the centre of it. It's regardless that it doesn't pay any regard to the fact that it leaves the place looking a mess, and to put things back into their place. And this is something that we learn living in the temple, and something that is useful to adopt in our ordinary circumstances. Just get used to putting things back into their place. This is a form. It's a form that leaves no ripples. At the end, it leaves no ripples, no traces. And this is the correct attitude, or it's looked upon. It's an attitude that's seen as well worth cultivating in this practice. Well, how can we interpret that into an everyday practice for a practitioner who's living in lay life? Well, we can learn to do the same thing. If we take the cup and we have a cup of coffee, we can just get used to, instead of leaving it for later, saying, I'll deal with it later, just cultivate that feeling of carefulness, of respect, of gratitude, to be able to feel some gratitude that the cup has given me something to drink. The thought comes, it doesn't matter, I can do it later. Well, yes, it does matter, actually, because with a feeling of gratitude, we want to restore the cup to its original cleanliness. We clean it, we dry it, we put it back into the cupboard as it was before. The same with the plate and the knife and the fork and so on. And if we cultivate that attitude of carefulness with that feeling, with that sense of gratitude, actually gradually in life, actually quite quickly in life, we begin to feel connected again with our circumstances. Things literally take on a life of their own, and we are now in a relationship with things rather than living in a dead world where there's no feeling to you and you have no feeling for me. It becomes quite a different world, and there's a real joy and warmth that comes back into this. Once we start doing this, what we discover fairly quickly is that there are times when we can bring this off, and there are other times when we don't. Quite often we'll forget about it. We'll just think, we go back into our old habit, and just perhaps for long periods of time forget about it. Other things come up and preoccupy me. I get carried away with something. I become upset about something, and the door slams, and I stomp my way down the hallway, and I slam the refrigerator door, or I knock something over in my haste. And really, what's at the back of all this, what's actually beginning to emerge now, is that we become aware in consciousness of this other power, a tremendous force that's known as, that's this technical term in Buddhism is called the kleshas. But in common parlance, these are the passions. These are the fiery emotional states that we have and that seem to come over us from time to time. We become preoccupied. We become obsessed. We become compelled by something. Impatience, maybe. Boredom, maybe. And we're driven by these states. And when we are overcome by these states, then all care and consideration usually goes right out the window. Most of the time it's because we forget. But even if we're reminded, actually, we can't be bothered. At that moment, I just don't care anymore, because that's what a passion does. It zones us right in, focuses us right in, absorbs us right in, and says, never mind anything else. This is all that matters. Having this right now. And then we come back to ourselves. Maybe a few regrets, maybe not. I don't know. But anyway, the point is we've strayed from the path that we originally set out for ourselves. And so, actually, these forms become a very good barometer for the passions, for how easily we are carried away by the passions, and how they do indeed tend to carry us away. And it has to be said. This is a lifelong practice precisely because of this. These passions run deep, and they're closely attached to why? Because these passions are the impulses that we were talking about earlier. They come and snatch me away, and they tend to be tied to this notion of myself, what suits me, what doesn't suit me. And they tend to ignore the situation, ignore the circumstances, so we no longer feel connected with them. I just become obsessed with myself. So the forms are great revealers in this way. If we begin to practice good form, for example, like the carefulness and putting things back and just paying attention to the circumstances and so on, then when we neglect to do those things, when we begin to reflect back and suddenly realize that we've been neglecting things, we ask ourselves why, and we can perhaps begin to look and see fairly quickly that we have become preoccupied with myself or some other things, some obsession that's come up. And this leads really to one final item, which is to just one useful practice is to try putting together a timetable, a very simple timetable to give a little bit of structure to our day. Most of us probably have some structure. If you've got a regular job, then you'll probably have a structure. But it just adds one or two little bits and pieces. On this timetable, you simply have a time to get up and a time to go to bed. If you're doing some zazen, some sitting meditation, you can put that on it too. And just to see if we can follow it, say for 6 days of the week out of 7, have one day off. But 6 days of the week, and you may have to adjust it according to, if you're working so many days and other days you don't work and so on. Use common sense on this, but it's just to take away a little bit of that doing things when it pleases me, and just having circumstances that I now have to give myself to. And what usually happens, say, if I've set the alarm for 7 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off. First day I get out of bed, no problem. Second day the alarm goes off at 7, I get out of bed, no problem. Third day comes along, the alarm goes off, just 10 more minutes, and I hit the snooze button. And then just as I turn over, this other little nagging thought comes that says, well, I'm supposed to be doing this spiritual practice, and I'm trying out this timetable. I should be getting up straight away. As soon as the alarm has been switched off, get up, out of bed. But I don't want to. I want 10 more minutes. Well, you subscribe to this practice, get out of bed. No, I've already got out of bed 2 days running when the alarm went off. I'm not going to do it this time. But it's not just for 2 days, it's to keep going on at it. And suddenly we find ourselves in that internal conflict. And we may just be thinking at this point, well, what is the point in all this? Isn't life difficult enough than actually going out making conflicts? Well, the beauty of the timetable is that actually there's no moral value in itself, whether you get up at 7 or 10 past 7. But the point is that it produces an internal dilemma. It produces the classic horns of the dilemma, because what we have here are two conflicting things within ourselves, within our own psyche. There's the fact that we've considered that we want to follow this practice, but then in the moment the impulse comes up that says, not right now. No, I don't want to do that. And it's that power that we are interested in, because this leads on to a whole other subject that's very important, called working with the fires. And this working with the fires, without which no spiritual practice really goes. This is the real transforming agent. It's the emotional powers that are absolutely central, the passions that are absolutely central. We do not cut off from them. What we are doing is actually learning to contain them. And when they are contained, those forces begin to change, and they produce the changes that are necessary to walk the spiritual path, because there's an old saying in the Mahayana that the passions are the Buddha nature, and the Buddha nature, the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha nature, actually is forged from the same energy that those impulses and passions come from. So we cannot cut ourselves off from them, and we don't want to. They're our life after all. They have all that strength, but they are blind. They ignore the circumstances, and they are enslaved by the attachment to I. So what the practice does is to seek to liberate them, liberate that energy from that tight confine of that narrow cell of I, to open up and become once again in harmony with the circumstances around. And what is found is that that same energy now becomes the clarity of vision, which is the wisdom, and also the warmth of heart, which is the compassion that we hear so much of in Buddhism.